Thank you very much for inviting me. I always love to come to Ottawa. I haven't been here for a while, and I will try to get through what is a very interesting saga in the world, and in Canada in particular. Maiden voyage, challenges and assisted suicide in Canada. Well, first, for those who know me, I'm a narrator. I like stories. I write as much as I can with stories. So I like a historical perspective. So just so you know, this is not new. We're not a leader in contemporary times. There's been an evolutionary process in modern times. There's a change in values, evolution, Western medical, and there are many parallels in the way these things develop, and I find there are a lot of parallels when you look at things like abortion, legalization of marijuana, same-sex, LGBT. I have a son who's a musician, so I know everything there is to know about marijuana. He's constantly teaching me new things. For those who really want to know what this is all about, and just so you know, it's on Netflix now, The Meaning of Life. And for those who like the Monty Python genre, this is one of the better ones. So it goes back, the whole idea goes back a long time, and I always tell a lot of my religious, especially Jewish friends, you know, this goes back to the Bible and King Saul, and David was fighting, furious battle, the tide was turning, and Saul's army was routed, and his sons were killed, and Saul was wounded, and give or take a little, he didn't want to fall into enemy hands, so he asked one of the armor bearers to kill him, who couldn't do it, so somebody else did it, and that was, in some ways, an early rendition of assisted dying. And these are many of the renditions through art over the centuries. Ancient Greece, evolution of euthanasia, perceptions in Greek culture. So for those who know something about Greek culture, death was a preoccupation, and it was before the dawn of civilization. Multi-dimensional moral problem, end of life, and different approaches. And for those who remember Socrates, you know, he was given a cup of hemlock. I mean, he didn't go out and harvest it. So it wasn't a suicide, it was an assisted suicide, and we often refer to that as almost a heroic act, but he had to get somebody to help him out with it. And for those who are interested in history, and I just watched the Ken Burns documentary on the Civil War. For those who haven't seen it and are interested, I have an interest in the Civil War as a former American. For those who don't recognize it, that is a Brooklyn accent, modified by Scottish and Canadian and whatever else. But the Civil War was a horrible war, as all civil wars are. And there are many, many examples in the narrative of the Civil War of what one would classify, or one could, as assisted suicide, mercy killing, whichever term you want to use. And this is an example described here, Dr. Joseph Holt. I turned to him, he pointed to his left arm, quickly exposed that cannonball had nearly torn away. And it's interesting, in the Ken Burns documentary, they talk about the new weaponry that really was developed, as all wars do, new technologies, new weaponry that was so much more vicious than previous weaponry, in that it didn't just make a hole as other bullets used to, but it caused terrible, terrible damage. So he torn away his shoulder, and he made some encouraging remarks. He says, "Doc, that's nothing. Here is where I'm really hurt." And he laid back the blanket, and there his whole abdominal contents were spilling out. And, "Doctor, how long do I have to live?" Now, we've all heard that. For those of us who do palliative care, people want to know how long. And he said, "Well, a few hours." And we all know that prognosis is a mug's game, but he probably knew that it wasn't going to be a long time. And he said, "Let me die easy. Dear doctor, I would do the same for you." His soul peered from the depths of his blue eyes in an appeal of anguish that cut me to the heart, and I replied, "You dear noble fellow, I will see to it that you shall die easy." You have to remember these words, because we hear them over and over again. There was no thought of the dramatic. It was dreadfully genuine. And he handed a 2-ounce bottle of black drop, which I presume was very, very, very concentrated opium, He handed him the cup. He feebly waited, saying, "Come around, boys. Let us have a toast. I do not invite you to drink with me, but I drink the toast to you in the Southern Confederacy and to victory." He grabbed the last drop, returned it, and think about some of the recent cases that are in the paper, and you'll see how reminiscent this narrative is. So you could say technically this was physician-assisted suicide, battlefield euthanasia, whatever you want to call it. But we know that it took somebody to give something to somebody else in order to do it. He didn't shoot him, which he could have done also. They do that to horses, right? First, I don't know if they do it to horses anymore, but I don't know. First World War, I could go through all the wars. I just picked a couple. Worst was one fellow whose legs were horribly burned, pinned down, impossible to get him out. Flames were simply eating him up. He must have been in terrible shape. Like many other counts, he fails to mention if they'd done the deed, but he kept shouting, "For God's sake, shoot me." Vietnam War. Now, my narrative is I am actually in Canada because of the Vietnam War, but not my recent emigration to Canada. I actually emigrated twice, but that's a long story. But the first time was during the Vietnam War. I had studied in Britain, came back to Boston. At the height of the Vietnam War, all the interns were talking about is, what do we do to get out of it? And it was complicated, and I was accepted into the public health service. I could have been on an Indian reservation, and then they canceled the program. I don't know why they canceled the program. I think they needed bodies and helicopters, because that's what doctors were doing in those days. But there was a lot of stories from Vietnam, as you can imagine. Terrible situation he found himself in. A Green Beret, elite special forces, came under heavy fire, shot in several places, still alive. His comrade was in serious pain, but what scared him most was that he might die in the jungle, to be eaten by a wild animal or captured by the enemy. There was no way to get him out. The wounded soldier begged my acquaintance to take his life by shooting him. My acquaintance took out his pistol and complied with the wishes of his friend out of a sense of compassion as well as obligation. The very important words when you hear about the literature and the commentary of the current. So, evolution of suicide's legality. Now, some of it I get from Wikipedia. You can look up. I know it's not the best source in the world, but it is easy. And most of it, unless you're talking about something very complex, it's accurate. So, it is a crime in some parts of the world. However, while suicide has been decriminalized, in actually most Western countries, the act is still stigmatized and discouraged in other contexts, such as ancient Rome and medieval Japan. Suicide was seen as a defiant act of extreme personal freedom or perceived against actual tyrants. If you remember, I mean, you may not because it's American history, Patrick Henry, "Give me liberty or give me death. I regret that I have only one life to give for my country." So while a person who has committed suicide is beyond the reach of the law, there can still be legal consequences in the cases of treatment of the corpse, the fate of the person's property. So most Western countries have dealt with it and decriminalized it. I'll tell you, when I was a medical student, I came back to the States just to get a visit with my family and to learn something. I learned how to take blood. I took more blood. I was the venipuncture maven of Brookdale Hospital, which stood me well in my later years of training. So we were doing rounds, and those were the days when the professor did rounds and all the ducklings stood behind the professor waiting to hear his words of wisdom. And there was a relatively young woman who came in, and he's talking, and I said to the resident next to me, "What's she in for?" And he says, "Accidental overdose." And I sort of nodded knowingly, and I thought, accidental overdose? What did she take? 60 capsules of seconal-barbital. I thought, 60 capsules? That's quite an accident. So after he came to me, he said, "Don't you understand?" I said, "I don't understand how you take 60 capsules of Seconal accidentally." He said, no, it was a attempted suicide, but you can't put that on her hospital record because it's terrible for the family and her reputation. This way it was an accident. And it really stuck with me because it seemed bizarre. But I was very young, very naive, but I wasn't out of step in that it was bizarre, and yet that was very common. But in 1985, for those who are interested in ethics, the philosophers James Childress, it's pronounced Childress, and Tom Beecham, it's pronounced Beecham, even though it's spelled Beauchamp, published the first American bioethics, Principle of Biomedical Ethics, and I went to one of their courses, 1 week, Instant Ethicist. It was really good. It was better than Doritos, in terms of the rapid ingestion of salt. And for those who know the mantra, respect for autonomy, maleficence, non-maleficence, beneficence, and justice. Now, about this time, we had the murmurings in the Netherlands. So it started in 1973. The Postma case the physician facilitated death of her mother, and there was a court case, and that was the beginning of allowing, under certain circumstances, assisted suicide before the law came into being, which basically codified the steps that one had to take for no prosecution. So in many ways, the Netherlands were the leader in the concept of assisted suicide euthanasia. That's the way they call it, because it's both, either assisted or actual doing. Now, after the Netherlands, soon after, Belgium passed a similar law. And then in Switzerland, Dignitas, which is one of a number now of non-profit, voluntary enterprises that assist people in suicide. The difference is it has nothing to do with the nation. It's not part of the Swiss government legislation policy. It's a private organization that has a mandate to assist, and the thing that makes it popular is you can go to it from anywhere in the world. I've had a number of patients come from Toronto who've gone to it. There was just an article, which I didn't add to this talk, of a very well-known 104-year-old scholar who went because he felt his time was up and it was just too complicated, as you'll see, to get through the system here. He went, he fulfilled the criteria, and he was cared for there. So in 1998, since 1998, 2,100 people have died with Dignitas, but there are a number of other similar organizations in Switzerland. And then we have the saga of Dr. Kevorkian. Some of you may remember Dr. Kevorkian. He was certainly in the media. He was often referred to as Dr. Death. For those who supported him, he was a hero. For those who opposed him, he was a villain of the worst kind, medical pathologist. That didn't bode well for his reputation. For those who have done, I did pathology for a period of time, and it's a different world. I mean, you're not there as a clinician. You're there to find out why someone died. The best experience I had in all this was I did a stint in southern England with a coroner. And so we ran around doing pathology as a coroner where all you wanted was the cause of death. And let me tell you, talk about a fast PM compared to a medical PM, because you were looking for a cause of death. So if somebody had an exit from a bullet wound, you didn't start peeling away the eyebrows, unless it was in the brain, of course. Now, in arguing for the right of terminally ill to choose how they die, Dr. Kevorkian challenged social taboos about disease and dying while defying prosecutors in the courts. He taunted them, and then he ended up in prison for the death of about 130 alien presidents. He would video what he was doing. He would set up like Rube Goldberg little machines in which the person would push a button, a ball would go around like a cyclone roller coaster, hit a lever that pushed another lever that injected. You know, he wanted to show that I'm not doing anything. I just gave them the machine. Anyway, he was originally sentenced to 10 to 25 years. He was released after assuring authorities that he wouldn't do it again. And there was a recent comment that said, "Thank you, Dr. Kevorkian. I wish no one had to suffer greatly while on their deathbed and loved ones having to look on." So depending on your perspective, he's either a hero or just an old-fashioned villain. So what about the United States? Physician-assisted death or aid in dying is legal at this point, and this changes all the time. Referendums and elections in 7 states, with Oregon being the first, Washington being the second. And the laws expressly state actions taken in accordance with the act shall not for any purpose constitute suicide, mercy killing, homicide. Anyway, what it did is turn it into a legal act, and it went through a lot of back and forth with the federal, at the time, the Attorney General, was it Ashcroft? Yeah, tried to quash it, and they had another election, another referendum. So in Oregon, has had physician-assisted suicide since 1997. Not long ago, there was an article by a doctor who does it in Oregon, I think it was in the Toronto Star, explaining why he did it, that he was doing it truly as part of his medical obligation responsibility. And he wrote about his whole experience in medicine and why he came to feel that this was part of his duty to people who fulfilled the criteria. So according to the 216 data summary, prescriptions have been written for 1749 people, because all you could do in Oregon is give a prescription. You're not doing euthanasia, you're doing assisted suicide. Here's a prescription, which is interesting conceptually, because do you need to get a prescription for a doctor to kill yourself? I want to hear a resounding no. It's not hard to kill yourself. I recently had cataract surgery, and the instruction slip said, "Don't get water in your eyes." Since I'm looking around here, and most of the audience are women, how do you take a shower without getting water in your eyes? It's not easy. So I figured out, I'll do it. I took a plastic bag, right? I wish I had a photograph of this. I took a Galati bag, which was our local grocery store, and put it over my head and took a shower so I couldn't do my hair. That was another story. But I didn't get water in my eyes. But the thing I found interesting, has anybody taken a shower with a bag over their head? You don't know what you're missing. I began to feel dizzy because I was breathing, but the bag, was collapsing. I thought, this is how you do it. 5 more minutes of this, my wife would have found me on the bathroom floor, for better or for worse, right? Anyway, so the thing about Oregon, and there's a lot written about it, the fact that you get a prescription doesn't mean you have to do it, but it gives you the freedom to say, I can do it if I want. And as we know, many people don't follow through for various reasons, because they often get offered an alternative, which for the most part is a good, robust palliative care program. And we see that a lot where I work. We have a lot of requests, not a lot, on the palliative care program for MAID. And what we basically say, we can do this, but in the meanwhile, because we'll get to it, cumbersome process, we will do our best to make you comfortable. And usually, they don't pursue it because they're comfortable in terms of what it is that's driving them. Oops. What did I do wrong here? Murmurings. Am I doing something wrong? Okay, Canada, legal assisted suicide. Suicide was decriminalized only in 1972. I'm looking around the audience, most of you were already born, right? Give or take a little. So until 1972, it was illegal to commit suicide. Now, how it got manifest, the illegality was through insurance. You couldn't get buried, depending on the religion in your church, synagogue, mosque, plot. There may have been repercussions to your family. Nobody ever said. Now, my wife's an inveterate obituary reader. Does anybody here like reading obits? The New York Times did a whole thing on it. And so she's constantly figuring out family dynamics. Oh, Michael, look at this. 2 obits on the same person. Different people mentioned. Oh, that's King Lear. So a decree in 1972, physician-assisted suicide had been legal in Quebec, whereas referred to as medical aid and dying since June 2014, became legal in the entire country in 2016 due to a case that went eventually to the Supreme Court. Before it was amended, the criminal code said everyone who aids or abets a person to commit suicide, whether suicide ensues or not, is guilty of an indictable offense and is liable to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 14 years. So we know that there were cases that made it into the public, when I say the media, domain. And then there was the first challenge. So the most prominent case until the most recent was Sue Rodriguez, diagnosed. ALS has been a hallmark of many of the cases for various reasons for those who care for people with ALS. People are awake, alert, competent. It's a horrible death. And my first case was while I was a resident in Israel with a very Orthodox man. And it was very complicated for those who know Judaism. We kept having to get rabbinical decisions on what we could and could not do, because the goal was to try to keep him alive, and it was very complicated. We, not to cross religions, we resurrected an iron lung from the polio days that was in the basement, and I really am sorry, I used to have a picture of it, and it was yellow, so we called it the Yellow Submarine. And they took it out and they got the mechanic to look at it, and only the rubber seals had to be replaced. And we got it going with the idea that we put this man in it and it would breathe for him. So my boss looked at me and said, "Michael, try it out." He always said that to me. So they put me in. Has anybody here seen an iron lung in process? He put me in, and you're kind of sealed up here, and I could see the mechanic going and pushing the button, and you could hear it whirring, and all of a sudden, all the air in me got sucked out. He did it twice, and I sort of indicated, it worked. And this man was put in it, and indeed it worked. And we thought, wow, his rabbi was happy. And then what happened, as you can imagine, he aspirated. Well, you aspirate with negative pressure. This is not, you gotta just suction. And he died. So Sue Rodriguez, ALS, requested the Canadian Supreme Court allow someone to aid her in dying, or request appeal to the principle of autonomy and respect for every person. Everyone has the right to self-determination. But she lost in the case, but look at it, it was only 5 against 4. And as you know from Supreme Court, especially the United States, what turns one flavor of the court to another can be one person. And it's a big issue. And then June 15 to 12, there was another case, Gloria Taylor, Supreme Court, also ALS. And it worked its way up BC and then up to the Supreme Court, and it had a different result. It found that relevant sections were legislatively overbroad, had a disproportionate effect on people with disabilities, and were grossly disproportionate to the objectives it is meant to accomplish. And this one in the Carter versus Canada, 9-0. So you could see how in 10 years, I mean, it's different judges, some were the same, some different, but the culture of the country, and remember, courts do reflect, depending on how you interpret the court. In the States, it's the Constitution. Here, it's the Charter. And, you know, there are those who are purists and those who are interpretists and whatever. But the fact is, it was an unambiguous judgment, and the court gave the government a year to come up with legislation. And then it got a bit of a reprieve because there was an election in the middle. And then it started the fight to death almost 3 years ago. The Supreme Court ruled, and since that time it has been a bit of a battle for various reasons. One step forward, few steps back, new roadblocks, universal health, federal, criminal code, healthcare delivery, provincial. For those who love to study, and I, as an American, I look at it from the point of view of my upbringing, which was federal state. And we know in the United States, the states have a lot of power. We see it playing out especially now. But here, it's the same dichotomy, federal, provincial, and the way it's set up, for better or for worse. Does Canada have, a universal healthcare system? You could answer that as yes and no, because you have a federal act, and then you have the provinces. And in MAID, it plays a role, reaching a balance, competing values. There's generally conservative medical culture. That's true everywhere, for good and for bad. Provincial exemptions that allow publicly funded faith-based institutions. Some may argue that was the first era. And long-term care homes, second era. To reviews to provide MAID on premises, but with the numerous challenges as to the last time I looked, which was recently, but this was about 2,500 documented MAID in the past 3 years. And Quebec is always a little bit ahead of the curve, so they formulated a process earlier than the rest. And we have bizarre results of the current opposition. Many religious facilities appear to be immune to MAID being carried out on their premises. Many physicians, some for religious, some for ethical, refuse to participate in MAID at any level. Ethics of refusing to refer. And I deal with many physicians of this ilk who happen to be very Orthodox observant, and Baycrest has a very, very strong affiliation to Judaism. So we've had to basically juggle the law, personal preferences, referral to, in quotes, religious freedom, which that's a whole other lecture about what it means to have religious freedom, which often gets misinterpreted. And you can look at it in many ways. The parallel is the position on abortion, of people refusing to provide what is legally allowable, which is abortion, and even refer. I mean, the argument that I always say, if you're at St. Michael's Hospital and you walk in and say, I want an abortion, I mean, according to the rules, they say, what's an abortion? How do you spell that? I mean, nobody says that. But you say, well, are you allowed to refer to another hospital? Well, some would say no. It says, okay, don't refer to another hospital. Say, you know what? For those who know Toronto, go out of the front, turn right, you get to University Avenue. Walk up 6 blocks, you get to Mount Sinai Hospital. Walk into Mount Sinai Hospital and repeat the question. So I'm not referring you to another place. I'm just telling you, I'm giving you a GPS lesson. And it's interesting because, well, I have colleagues who say, even what tells us we have to do is tantamount to doing. Now that's that's an hour lecture to be following this lecture on the whole concept of the ethics of providing information as opposed to doing. Now, and I say just in, it's already 2 months. Ontario court rules against religious doctors who objected to making referrals for assisted death and abortion, which was a CPSO policy. I worked at the CPSO for 16 years, and they made it quite clear that you have an obligation, if you can't do something, to refer, no different from every other part of medicine. Can you imagine surgeons saying, I don't do hernias? Too bad. Isn't there another hernia doctor in the province? I have no idea. Isn't there a way of finding out? I don't know. I mean, can you imagine? The court said the benefits to the public outweigh the cost to the doctors. Very interesting, and for those who read the letters to the editor, some of which were from doctors I know very well, this was an abomination. How can you tell us? And I tell people, listen, nobody forces. There's an old dictum, a biblical dictum in the Talmud, in the Jewish, that says, despite who your mother was, you don't have to be a doctor, right? But if you become a doctor, you're obligated to heal. Very important concept in medicine. Physician made in a long-term care facility on request of resident without credentials. So there was a Jewish home in BC. Doctor came Killed somebody. That was in the Vancouver Sun, of course. Complex story. Patient wanted to die at home. Where does he live? In this particular long-term care facility. He didn't want to wait for the transfer. It's getting too complicated. One of the physicians, she's well known, she's in the media a lot, entered the home at night with permission of patient and family, provided the service. It was a big hoo-ha. I even had somebody very senior in my own administration say, she shouldn't have been allowed to go into that home and provide a service. And I looked, and I put my foot in my mouth and said, why not? She's a registered doctor. That's a home. It was a house call. You don't need, think about it, you don't really need to be credentialed, even though we do it to make sure you're not a wizard, to go into a home. You shouldn't have to, according to the normal construct of this is your home. So then the disagreement to the patient's right and physician's right to duty to provide service. This is probably going to go to trial, and I'm willing to bet, I'll take bets, that the doctor will not be found guilty of anything, but they'll say it's really nicer to tell, but you're not obligated to do so. Uragan et al. PSA, not euthanasia, and that's an important concept because what you're doing is giving a prescription. And looking at Oregon et al., give or take a little, just look at the rules. You're supposed to be terminally ill. That's an interesting concept. So if somebody can tell me what the definition of terminally ill is, you get the Nobel Prize. Oh no, I forgot, Trump got 2 of them already. There are none left. None left. Must have 6 months or less to live. That's another one. That you could take odds, because most of us have been wrong. So I usually don't give that kind of, how long do I have? I say, I can tell you how long you don't have. You don't have 2 years. You likely don't have a year. But from a year to tomorrow, and then I tell all the things that happened to people. And in last year with the flu epidemic, I lost 3 of my patients in a week. I mean, it wasn't the same week, but over a week, who were functioning, for those of us in practice, mild cognitive impairment, staying at home, blah, 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 boom, from a bit of a respiratory infection that went, wow, and we all know that. Okay, request, yes, request. Convince 2 physicians that I know what I'm doing. You haven't been influenced by depression. Now, we know that depression hasn't really been shown to be a risk factor, but it can be. So we try to make sure people aren't morbidly depressed, because maybe their opinion will change. Feasible alternatives, but you're not obligated to pursue feasible alternatives, but most of us will offer. And you have to wait, similar to here, for 15 days. It's arbitrary. Why 15 days, I don't know, but okay. For a second sober thought. I thought the Senate does that. Isn't what the Senate do, second sober thoughts? Does that mean everybody has to abstain for a week before they give? Did you hear about the Trump's doctor who always had his aides bring him Diet Coke and rum, because he didn't want to put any calories on, Under the proposed law, a person who met all the requirements could receive a prescription for a barbiturate that would be enough to cause death. And physicians would be prohibited from inducing death. So it was a compromise, and that's part of American culture. You don't want to be seen as actually doing it, but giving person the autonomous ability to do it. Concept and regulation about eligibility, grievous and irremediable medical condition. So this is the May criteria. To be considered as having a grievous and irremediable medical condition, you must meet the following criteria. You must have a serious illness. Again, tell me, what does that mean? What means? Or disability, be an advanced state of decline that cannot be reversed. I mean, I'm old enough to remember diseases that got reversed. Historical perspective, I saw the first dose of intravenous Lasix be given to, I'll say, roughly 30-year-old woman in Dundee, Scotland, with microstenosis and florid pulmonary edema, who came in those days. If you didn't drown, you were treated with a phlebotomy, morphine, digitalis, and luck. And I was watching as the registrar, which is senior resident, came, and one had a book and one had a syringe, and they gave this woman an intravenous injection, and within 20 minutes, the bed was flooded, and she said, "I feel better already." And it was pure miracle. And that's medicine. For those of us old enough, of which in this room there's only 2 of us, we saw those. Beta blockers. I have a colleague, a cardiologist, who I went with residents with, and he says, if they ever found that propranolol, which is an old one, caused cancer, I'd kill myself. Because it changed the whole world of cardiology. I mean, there's many, 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 many. Advanced state of decline that cannot be reversed. So that, it gives a kind of construct, but it's not particularly accurate. So if you start focusing on it, as lawyers often do, I hope there are no lawyers in there, you can make yourself and your patients crazy. So it says, unbearable physical and mental suffering from the illness, disability. Now that's a really hard one. How people experience illness is very unique. Unbearable, physical, mental, very, very hard. Where your natural death has become reasonably foreseeable, that's another one. We have people who come into palliative care, I'm sure you do all the time, referred from another place with expected life expectancy, They come in. One of the cases we had, it's because of the old timer, it was a cardiac thing, and I was looking at the chart. I said, this patient has never had digitalis. The primary care physician said, you know what, I've never prescribed digitalis. That's an age factor. Now, is digitalis a perfect drug? Of course not. But for those of us old enough, it was a life-saving drug often. So we put this person on digitalis, and we got months. It's like, but I was supposed to die. Yeah, well, supposed is a funny term. So you're supposed to know everything there is to know and then be able to give a prognosis. Natural death has become reasonably foreseeable. Again, predicting is hard. Some illnesses is very hard, ALS being one. Unbearable physical or mental suffering, I mentioned, because what's bearable for one person may not be bearable for another, and cannot be relieved under conditions that you consider acceptable. Now, I don't know what that means in terms of relieving symptoms. Some people said, I want to be treated, but I don't want any opiates because I read in the paper that they're bad. Have you not had anybody like that? The children, don't give my mother any opiates. And you're spending the next week or 2 negotiating. Details of bungled transfers are starting to filter out elsewhere across the country. There was the mismanaged incident that prompted Providence Healthcare in BC to apologize for a foreseeable and preventable issue. And then there's the wheelchair-bound man with multiple sclerosis in Vancouver whose catheter bag split open in a taxi transfer. So I don't know, is that grounds for a claim from the taxi to whoever? The maker of the catheter bag? The hospital? Think about it. In the meanwhile, process may be too lengthy, too stressful, too long, and beyond the limited number of physicians willing to participate. I know that in my own region, a lot of doctors won't. They don't want to be part of it. It's cumbersome, and they just don't feel right, and others feel the opposite. You do not need to have you shouldn't need to have a fatal or terminal disease. It's not really in the legislation. So what's the problem? What level of capacity, understand and appreciate, is that enough? That's a pretty limited. It's the one we use often in law, and we use it in ethics. Change in clinical condition. Why should the consent lapse when you've given it shortly before? It's like you could end up having to renegotiate your consent if you have an undulating illness. So here we have one that made it into the paper. Assisted death allows a couple of 73 years to die together. March 27, they died holding hands in their own bed in a retirement home. Thus far, 2,500 Canadians or others have been able to do that. What were the potential barriers to achieving permission? Death must be reasonably foreseeable and intolerable suffering, reversal, decline. Now, this is the couple. You could see that they were very devoted. This was the wedding on the right when he was in the military, and this was walking through this is the equivalent of a two-person walker, just so you know. But one of them is multi-purpose. It's also an umbrella. Something we tell people never to do, right? I'm sure somebody's going to come up with a proper umbrella cane. Just think of it as a marketing thing. Somebody should just come up with the name, umbrella cane or something. So the wife was considered eligible for maid, which the couple had planned. They invited the family. She had a number of severe medical problems for which she suffered, but none that would normally fulfill hospice or palliative care. The husband, one physician agreed to maid. The second did not see that he had a condition that portended death other than advanced age and frailty. The couple had no intention of dying separately. Whoops. Oh, what did I do? Back. Last dude. Of course I wouldn't go without him. We had to wait and wait. Then think of this, miraculously. Huh? Is this the quote of quotes? He started to go downhill, she added. Then each had an intercurrent illness, almost could not coordinate their state of illness to allow for maid. It almost sounds like a cruel William Faulkner play, you know? Questions raised in this case. Who decides the stage of illness? What does reasonably foreseeable mean in aged, frail individuals with comorbidities? What is more important, the quality of the end of life or the fulfilling of created but not necessarily patient-centered values? Complex ethical question, autonomy and beneficence, choice and assistance, or avoiding potential harm. Making a choice that might theoretically be reversed, would this couple or one of them change their mind? If anybody knew anything about them? Or not be capable after an illness while awaiting the perfect timing for maid? For how far ahead should the determination of capacity be valid? A day? A week? A month? A year? Why any limits unless evidence of profound reason for change? I hear these discussions all the time. Quick, get them while they're still lucid. Right? Is that before lunch? Quick. The maiden voyage has not been simple. Much has been accomplished. Oh, by the way, I just want to go back. I was going to put another slide in here, but I didn't want to alter it. So James Downer, who you may know from Toronto, who's a critical care physician and ethicist, wrote an article in response to this couple's death and a letter written by a doctor who questioned why frailty should be part of the equation in terms of determining whether somebody fulfills the criteria for maid. And he wrote, I think, an eloquent article saying, for those of us in the field, frailty is not a minor label. Frailty doesn't mean I trip once in a while. It means there's an involution of the organ systems, and you're just hanging in. Anybody who uses it, who does this for a living, knows that the frail person, the last thing you want them to do is fall, get an infection, sneeze 3 times, or choke on a hot dog. Boom. Because they're so at risk. And frail is a term we've developed. Ken Rockwood in the Maritimes has made almost a whole industry out of it. And we all kind of adhere to the concept, and we all know why shouldn't that be part of it. And he wrote a very eloquent, if you look it up, James Downer, D-O-W-N-E-R, I can't remember what journal it was in, but I thought it was a very compelling. And he kind of poo-pooed the comments of this other doctor. So, it's not been simple, much has been accomplished, assumptions that may have to be reconsidered, ethics is not always self-evident. We must put our patients first and not get stymied, and this is the important thing, by procedural blockages and erroneous assumptions. Must be careful to separate, very important, religious beliefs from the law and regulations that serve the public for whom religion is not an important value for consideration. Thank you very much.